You're listening to episode 253 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Gregory Lopez joins us to speak about how early Buddhist views of mindfulness compare and contrast with Stoic mindfulness. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, and our live online practice circle and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the Contributions button. There are many ways you can help which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and it helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. Stop me if you've heard this one. Some Buddhists feel that mindfulness is being co-opted. Well, I'm not going to stop, because secular Buddhists are fairly experienced with pushing back on this sense of entitlement of all thing Buddhist having to be done a certain way. Yes, change is hard, and new manifestations of practices and sometimes even just words can throw some folks into a tizzy. The interesting thing is, this is not a new phenomenon, and mindfulness isn't the exclusive purview of that tradition or even domain. The Stoics had their own mindfulness style. Greg Lopez has been a practicing secular Buddhist since 2008. He is also the founder and facilitator of New York City Stoics, as well as co-organizer of Stoic Camp New York and Stoicon 2016. In addition, he is director of membership for the Stoic Fellowship. His academic background is in science and pharmacy. Greg is a frequent speaker and presenter at science and philosophy-related events on behalf of Smart Recovery New York City, where he currently serves as president. During his spare time, Greg pursues his interests in meditation, philosophy, statistics, effective altruism, and swing dancing. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Stoic Pale Ale. I'm not kidding. Biffer House Brewing Company has Stoic Pale Ale. Our guest today is Gregory Lopez. Greg, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Ted.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation because it's exploring an area that I will admit I know almost nothing about. And so I'll appreciate just dialoguing with you on this and learning more about it. But let's start by having you tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, my background has very little to do with Stoicism technically, but I did form an interest in it early on. I kind of had an interesting conversation and dialogue in my personal experience between philosophy, Stoicism, and Buddhism overall. So I guess the best place to start is from the beginning. I took a couple of classes in just general Western philosophy in college. I went to a small liberal arts school in Oregon and was interested in it, but I just kind of took it as a kind of intellectual exercise. And over time, I am kind of an autodidact, so I learned more about different areas of philosophy on my own. Then, when I was in professional school, I came across a subsidized mindfulness-based stress reduction course. And simultaneously, I had a friend who was pursuing his master's degree in Buddhist philosophy. And so I was in conversation with him and also took the mindfulness course together. And that kind of stimulated my interest in Buddhism on the whole. And so I became interested in Buddhism and read Stephen Batchelor's work early on because I'm a self-professed atheist as well and had some issues with the metaphysical claims of Buddhism, but found that 90 to 95% of early Buddhism was highly practicable. And furthermore, the mindfulness taught to me in MBSR seemed to make a lot more sense within the context of the Eightfold Path. And so I decided to start practicing secular Buddhism. And that's what brought me to secular Buddhism. However, I also was unaware there was a big gap in my philosophical self-education, which was the Hellenistic period of ancient Greece. I read Plato and I read some Aristotle, but I really didn't read much more of that. I started volunteer work because I have a background interest in psychology with an organization that teaches cognitive behavioral techniques to people with addictive behaviors. And I found out that cognitive behavior therapy was highly influenced by this philosophy from ancient Greece during the Hellenistic period called Stoicism. And so I had a gap. I wanted to check it out. And I found that online people were actually trying to practice this philosophy in the modern world. And then I started studying Stoicism more on my own, found out that philosophy didn't always used to be an academic subject, that people actually used it as a way of life. And that got me further into Stoicism as a whole. And then I started the New York City Stoics, skepticism is a different field, in 2013, and that's what brings us to present day.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing about that. It's interesting, this overlap, because as you are probably aware, and many listeners of the podcast are, in addition to MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, there's also a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is a blending of mindfulness with the CBT and that kind of therapeutic intervention. So there's really some good synergies happening in these very disparate fields that have at their core some very deep common roots. It's fascinating to see that. And for those who are listening to the podcast, if this Stoicism stuff seems kind of familiar with regards to the podcast, it's because we did have Massimo Pigliucci on episode 220, speaking about secular Buddhism and Neo-Stoicism. So be sure to check that out as well. I'll be linking that on the episode page. So, Greg, let's talk a little bit about the topic at hand today, which is some similarities that you're noting and exploring about Buddhist mindfulness, sati, traditional sense, and a Stoic mindfulness. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Stoic side of that discussion first.
Yeah, and I think it's useful to kind of compare and contrast it with Buddhist mindfulness, sati. So there's a term that comes up in some Stoic texts that's called prosoke, and that is essentially what a lot of people equate with quote-unquote Stoic mindfulness. And it has a lot of interesting similarities, but also a lot of differences. And one of the main differences that anybody who wants to dabble in ancient languages like Pali and ancient Greek would find if they kind of went in and took a look for the term prosoke in the Stoic literature is that it's not going to come up nearly as much. I was listening to a podcast with John Peacock recently, and he mentioned that sati was the most commonly used technical term in the Pali canon. And prosoke is not. It is actually a fairly rare term. I've searched the ancient Greek texts as best as I could and have found only a few instances of it. And half the time, or maybe a little less than half the time that it's used in a very colloquial and obvious sense. Sati is a little more nuanced, and it's kind of hard to get a direct English translation. For prosoke, I think it's a lot easier. I think it just simply translates to attention. And that's kind of what Furosoke is about. But sometimes it's used just in a common way attention would be used, not as a technical spiritual practice of any sort. For instance, Marcus Aurelius says in his book, one of his meditations, that his father looked after himself, and looked after himself is Furosoke. So that's just what it is. He paid attention to himself. But at the same time, there are some spiritual trends that the ancient Stoics did focus on in terms of the term prosoke. And another Stoic teacher by the name of Epictetus, who is a former slave turned philosopher and teacher, has an entire section of his discourses dedicated to prosoke, or attention, appropriately entitled On Attention. And so that's where we get a lot of it. However, even when the term prosoke isn't used, there's still a lot of spirit in it that kind of makes it translate to or be comparable with Buddhist sati or mindfulness. Although there are actually a few other interesting terms in Buddhism that may be more appropriate. Two terms that come to mind are appamada, which is kind of diligence or heedfulness. And I think prosoke actually has a lot more to do with appamada per se than sati. And also there's yoniso manasikara, which is wise attention. And I think prosoke translates, the practice of prosoke translates a little more to those than to sati per se. But they're all kind of intertwined and not always entirely separable or clear. When I read the Pali Canon, I get the impression that the Buddha was probably speaking in colloquial terms or using terms that were in the culture of the time whose meanings have been somewhat lost to us, but I don't think he was creating a technical language. So I think when he said sati, he was just like, be mindful, try to remember things, which is the root of sati. When he was saying appamada, be not heedless. When he was talking about manasikaro, I think it was probably not like the later use where it had a presence in every mind moment in the technical Abhidhamma Buddhist psychology stuff, but instead it would probably just meant pay attention in a wholesome way. So that's kind of my basic comparison with prosoke overall, and those are the basics of where it comes from. It kind of got picked up the first time because it's not obvious that prosoke is a strong Stoic practice as a technical term itself, but there was a French scholar by the name of Pierre Hadot, who in the 1980s started writing about Stoicism, and he took up the term prosoke and really said, like, this is the fundamental Stoic spiritual attitude. And I think modern practicing Stoics have kind of inherited Hadot's inference from that. But looking at the primary text, it's not immediately clear that prosoke, that if you went to an ancient Greek school, they'd sit you down and give you a little lesson on prosoke per se.
I'm wondering if there's how much of prosoke is something you do versus simply a quality of being, a quality of mind, of attending. And the reason I'm asking about this is Massimo had mentioned his meditative practice, which is very, very different than even a secular Buddhist might approach a contemplative practice. It did involve certainly being present, but in somewhat of a different way than we have. So I'm curious if you've run across anything, and you may not have, that has to do with development of attention.
Yes, there is quite a bit of that overall. One of the similarities that you do see is in Marcus Aurelius's meditations. Marcus Aurelius, as a brief summary, was a Roman emperor who was a practicing Stoic, and we have what amounts to his personal journal, which in itself is a kind of spiritual practice, which came down to us and is currently titled Meditations, but some early translations gave it the title To Himself, because it was a personal journal not meant for publication. And it was kind of a spiritual exercise where he wrote out specific things to remind himself of what's going on. So in a sense, that in itself is a kind of Stoic mindfulness, but it's of a different sort, where one essentially journals to oneself in order to remember one's basic principles. So that's one basic kind of Stoic practice that can be translated somewhat to mindfulness, because you are attempting to keep certain things in mind, and you're doing a practice which is, I think the Greek term is a hyponemata, which is essentially essentially a journal to oneself in order to remind oneself of one's practice. But within the meditations, Marcus Aurelius also focuses lots and lots of time on the lots and lots of time and words on the present moment. He's very present moment oriented. I'm looking at a couple of passages now, like in Meditations 2:14. He says, "The longest lived and the earliest to die suffer an equal loss, for it is solely of the present moment that each will be deprived." So, and he has lots and lots of passages like this. And so, although Marcus doesn't actually use the term prosoke a lot of the times when describing attention, this is very related to the Buddhist notion of mindfulness and also modern psychological interpretations of mindfulness, like those we see in MBSR, which are slightly different from sati as well. I would say that the first step in Buddhist mindful practice is very similar. Stoic is very similar to Stoic mindful practice, which is focusing on the present moment, because getting lost in the past or worrying about the future is somewhat fruitless, since the past is already gone and outside of one's control, and the future hasn't arrived yet. So that would be kind of the first step of the Stoic mindful practice, is constrain your focus to the present moment, or constrain your attention to the present moment. In Epictetus's work, Discourses 4:12, which is the main text on prosoke, like I mentioned earlier, he kind of then mentions two different things to actually try to practice. And I kind of compare these to the Buddha's 4 foundations of mindfulness. I really like Thanissaro Bhikkhu's, not literal translation, as the frames of reference for the Satipatthanas, or foundations of mindfulness, because although that's not a literal translation, it really guides your practice, because that's how I personally interpret them when I practice Buddhist mindfulness, which is a kind of way to pay attention and view the world in a very specific way. That's samasati, that's right mindfulness, to view it in a certain way. And Epictetus kind of mentions 2 what I would call Stoic foundations of mindfulness to keep in mind, and frameworks for viewing the world. And those 2 things are, one, social role, as being, first of all, fulfilling your specific social role and acting appropriately at a given time, and also watching one's own value judgments about what's really valuable in life. And at each moment, see whether you're judging things as good or bad, and whether that value judgment is correct. So that's the beginnings of Stoic mindfulness, according to my interpretation. Is that clear so far? And do you have any questions about that?
It is, but I would add an observation that it's interesting to hear how monitoring one's judgment and thoughts, non-judgmental approaches to the present moment being one of those 3 primary aspects of contemporary mindfulness in MBSR sense of attending to the present with intentionality and in a certain way without being judgmental. And it doesn't mean we don't have discernment. We do have discernment. It's that we're not automatically buying into the value judgments of good or bad, and simply allowing things to be and experiencing them in a different way, maybe with some curiosity, that can help take the sting out of a lot of the things, or the overt attraction of a lot of our experiences. So it's interesting to hear that.
Yeah, I would say that aspect of non-judgmentalness is one thing in my understanding that separates modern psychological mindfulness from both Buddhist sati and Stoic prosoke. Because when you look at the ancient Buddhist texts, it really seems that the Buddha asks you to judge your initial impressions to some degree and separate them out as to whether they're harmful to yourself or others. That's his instructions to his son Rahula. And he mentioned that as one of his main practices that led him to enlightenment. And similarly, in Stoic practice, one takes one's initial impressions and it holds them up to the fundamental Stoic philosophical principle of whether it lies within your sphere of control or outside your sphere of control. And this is where a Stoic theory kind of informs practice. So when you, for instance, if I get angry at something, I can stop and hold back and say, wait a minute, just because I'm angry doesn't mean it's true. Let me see why I'm angry. And then perhaps I'm angry because I believe somebody should be behaving toward me in a certain way that they're not. But then I hold up the Stoic principle that other people's behaviors are not in my control. And Stoics equate what is within one's control with good or bad. And they say that those are the only true good, that's the only true goodness or badness in the world. Things that lie outside of one's control are what are called indifference. And Massimo may have gotten into this a little in his previous episode, although I don't recall. And so there are judgments both in Buddhist mindfulness to some degree and Stoic prosoche that kind of separate it out a little from modern Stoic, modern psychological aspects of mindfulness, according to my understanding of it.
So let's shift a little bit. I think you wanted to unpack this some more and have a bit of a discussion. I'm wondering what it is you'd like to examine in this.
Yeah, so I guess there are kind of two things. I was actually curious because one of the things that I'm sussing through a little bit is sometimes it's very unclear to me how the Buddha was using sati or mindfulness in a different way than things like yoniso manasikaro and appamada. And I think that Stoic mindfulness kind of leans away from sati and toward the latter two. But I was curious, based on your impressions so far, kind of what you think of Stoic mindfulness and how it compares by analogy to aspects of Buddhist mindfulness and other aspects of Buddhist practice.
I think that's a great question, and bear in mind that these insights are perhaps very dark insights and very inaccurate. So with that caveat that I really am wholly ignorant of the Stoic approach to this, it sounds like from what you've said, the definitions of what they mean by that do fit more into the bare attention kind of view, and that's a bit less of the more comprehensive kind of sati you would find in the Satipatthana Sutta, which is really explores these many different aspects of present moment mindfulness. So I don't see that the Stoicism goes into with quite the depth, even just at the surface level of the main four of contemplation of the body. And as we see it in reflections of the postures of the body, or just awareness of breath, or 32 parts of the body, that whole stuff, I don't see it as going into quite that level. Probably not as much, certainly not things like the cemetery contemplation. So even just that one foundation of awareness of physicality is really, really very desired and broken out into very distinct kinds of contemplative practices that one would do that have a desired outcome. They have something that one is supposed to get out of them, and not in a service fee kind of way, but there's some growing to be done, some awareness to be gained from that. Again, contemplative feeling, that second part, doesn't mean emotion. It's Vedana, it's sense, and it's really at the base level of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. And again, that might be a little closer to what I'm hearing in Stoicism, is that level is it's very foundational to our experience. Contemplation of consciousness, the third aspect of the four foundations. This one to me has always been a little bit tricky. It's the consciousness of, it seems, different mind states. And that perhaps would be the closest thing to what I'm hearing on the Stoicism is what's going on here? What is my experience in this moment? What is it like to be me here? And that sounds fairly close. And then when we get to things like the contemplative dhammas, this fourth foundation, it really is very specific to Buddhist ideas. We go into aggregates of clinging and sense spaces and all of that, and factors of enlightenment, things you're supposed to be contemplating that are along an ideological stance. I don't think that's part of what the Stoic part view of this is. So it seems that one is probably the least a good fit for the Stoic impression. So does that get a sense of what you're looking for?
Yeah, it does. And I think that there are some things I agree with in what you said, but also some things I may disagree with. There are some aspects I would overall, if I were to paint with a very broad brush, I would say that the difference between one of the main differences between Stoic mindfulness and Buddhist mindfulness is that Buddhist mindfulness tends to be a lot more inward turning, although in the Satipatthana Sutta, it's mentioned, you contemplate things both externally and internally. Whereas Stoic mindfulness seems to be a little more focused on external things overall. And there are a couple of interesting Stoic mindful practices that I can bring up to kind of back up what I'm saying here. And there's one Stoic practice that's related to what I would call Stoic mindfulness that Marcus Aurelius describes, which I call the decomposition practice. And so I'll read from Meditations 8:11, where Marcus Aurelius says to himself, "This thing, what is it in itself, in its own constitution? What is the substance and material? And what is its causal nature or form? And what is it doing in the world? And how long does it subsist?" These are a set of questions that a lot of Stoics ask themselves in order to try to practice sometimes what's called the discipline of desire, which is one of the three main Stoic practices or fields of practice that a practicing Stoic philosopher would undertake. And what Marcus is doing here is he's kind of decomposing things into their constituent parts. But it's focused externally, whereas Buddhist mindfulness a lot of times focuses one's own experience into their different parts. That's where the 5 skandhas come in, and the 12 nidanas, the independent origination. A lot of that is highly psychological, and we see that less in Stoicism, but we still see a kind of decomposition of external things, and it's kind of to take it apart and say, like, where is the desirableness or goodness of this thing? I don't see it if I take it apart. There's another passage in Marcus where he discusses a whole bunch of different things from fine clothes to dining, where he says, the flesh of a fine fowl is just, a little bit of meat on bone. And he says, my purple robe, the robe of an emperor, is simply just some cotton dyed in the blood of a shellfish. And this kind of decomposition exercise is meant specifically to kind of quell desire for external goods. So there are, and this kind of reminds me of the 4 elements practice of Buddhist mindfulness in the first foundation. And so I would definitely agree with you that we don't really see things like mindfulness of breathing or any kind of samadhi practices so much in Buddhism, in Stoicism, but we do see some things that are somewhat related to it in the first foundation. Similarly, I would say the third and fourth foundations are a little absent in Stoicism, but there is an interesting thing that Marcus said in that passage I read, which is you talk about, or you try to contemplate what things are doing in the world and how long they subsist. And this is a common theme in Marcus. And so in the fourth foundation of mindfulness, you take a look at the arising, passing away of dhammas. And in Stoic mindfulness, you do take a look at arising and passing away too, but instead you seem to be focused on external things like, well, if you consider your body an external thing, which the Stoics did, because it's not under one's control. Your health is not under complete control, for instance. And so you take a look at things and say, how did this thing come into being? What's its purpose in the world? And it's not going to last, and it's going to ultimately decompose and fade away. And in fact, the Stoics had another practice called premeditatio malorum, or negative visualization, where similarly to kind of like the cemetery meditations, you sit down and contemplate the worst things that can possibly happen to you.
The repulsiveness of the body, for example. This is part and parcel of Satipatthana.
Yep, and that's also a similarity with Stoicism. Stoicism does similar things. I don't know what rating the Secular Buddhist podcast is, but Marcus
We've occasionally been explicit. That's okay.
So yeah, so you could cut this out later if you want. But Marcus also, in his decomposition exercise, said that he says sex is just rubbing in a discharge of liquid. And so, by the way, historically, Marcus Aurelius and his wife didn't always get along, so maybe that says something. But
because he sounds like such a romantic, I can't imagine why.
Yeah, I hope he got that from his wife. But that's the kind of stuff that the Stoics did practice, and so they did take a look at that. One of the differences between Stoic practice and Buddhist practice, though, is that my understanding, both from practicing and reading secular Buddhism, is that the kind of path that you're on is a slow realization that everything is not satisfactory. And I think the word for that is nibbida in Pali, that if you look at things carefully for long enough, you just get kind of tired of it. And then you get more inspired to practice because external things don't seem as attractive. And that is a positive feedback loop of sorts. Stoicism kind of starts out with the philosophy. They make the arguments and then they say, okay, if you agree with these arguments, now you're going to go out and practice and hold up your experience to these precepts, what they call at-hand precepts. You have short, pithy phrases that you compare your experience to and remind yourself of constantly through journaling, as well as holding these statements in your mind And so when something goes wrong, like if somebody angers yourself, then you can say, this person is my brother and I've acted like this in the past. And then you just constantly refute your moment to moment judgments in that way.
Yeah, I've always stumbled a bit on having that kind of approach, because it seems to predetermine that these ideological stances are correct. And they may be. It's just that it doesn't leave a lot of room for creativity in the moment. It doesn't leave for a lot of room of interpretation in the unique circumstances of what's happening right now. So if we take, for example, an admonishment against killing, and a perhaps traditional view in Buddhism is that anytime there is killing, there's anger there. And on the surface, one might look at that. Yes, if I'm committing murder, there's probably some anger in there. I could see that. But I had a discussion with one of my teachers, a Buddhist nun, who, this is a very difficult time where we had just put to sleep one of our dogs, in fact, one of my dearest dogs. And Buford was suffering terribly with pancreatitis. It was a lot of pain. It was very evident that he was in a great deal of pain. And the emotional content at that point, being a meditator for well over a decade and 15 years, something like that, being fairly sensitive and aware to what my emotions were, and not really finding anger as part of my experience in the decision, the very difficult decision of having him put to sleep, which is, yes, killing. And so that's just one example of how I stumble a bit on having phrases and views which are supposed to catch everything, and they may not always be so. So with a secular approach to Buddhist teachings, one of the things that I've found to be very useful is to not predetermine what is the correct path. It might be the correct path for you where you are right now, but it might not be for others. And we might, in fact, do great harm by insisting that this way, our way, is the right way, which is one reason we try to avoid having a direct confrontational dialogue with people who have very different views than we do. Because if we tell someone in a particular tradition, no, you've got it wrong, it means this, not necessarily so. And it may be quite damaging to that individual, or certainly our relationship with them, to make that kind of assertion, which we can back up for our lives, but we might not be able to back up for their life, which is very unique and very different than our own. So it's interesting to hear how there are these nuances in how one approaches just moment by moment existence.
Yeah. And I agree. I think there's actually room. I mean, first of all, Buddhism is a flourishing tradition for 2,500 years. And so the term Buddhism doesn't really even point to one single thing. So there's a lot of ways to be a Buddhist just even within tradition before it came to the West. So I definitely agree with you there. I would say even within early Buddhism, there's a lot of flexibility. We do see the Buddha telling different things to different people, and that's probably because it was skillful to do so given the person's circumstances and goals at the time. So I definitely agree that there's not necessarily one way. One of the things that falls away in traditional or Theravada Buddhism is what is traditionally translated as clinging to rites and rituals on the path to enlightenment, but it uses the same word as morals, sila. And so it seems that one is kind of throwing away the raft when one gets to a certain point. But one of the things that I've personally found in my practice is that it's way too easy to justify breaking a rule. And so rules are super useful when you're early in the practice like I am, because at least it gives me a bright line. But definitely they're not something to be clung to.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a very good point that very often I've seen, in particular, the raft metaphor to be used as an excuse for, I don't need to practice. I've already reached X. Like, not necessarily so.
Right. It becomes a checklist.
It becomes a checklist, exactly. And the concept that, we've had this sometimes with folks on the discussion forums, or they'll post on Facebook, and the posting seems to be, in my interpretation, coming from a place of ego and a sense of accomplishment, and they're just, sharing with the rest of us grunts from their vastly superior wisdom in a voice that's wholly condescending and utterly devoid of compassion, which to me means, maybe there's something else there for you to still practice a bit.
One of the interesting differences from Stoicism, although we can't be sure of this because one of the vast differences between Stoicism and Buddhism is that Buddhism's literature is much more intact. We have a lot more surviving early documents and later documents since it was a living tradition. Whereas in Stoicism, a lot of what we know was written, because it's listed in other sources, is lost to us now. Plus Stoicism ended and then got a resurgence a couple of times throughout history, but it didn't have a continuous thing. So we can't be certain of what ancient Stoicism really was and how exactly it was practiced. But one of the differences is that, to my knowledge, Stoicism doesn't have that kind of, it doesn't say it has a path to becoming what the Stoics call a sage, which is the ideal in Stoicism to reach. In fact, they often make the claim that until you reach sagehood, everybody is similarly troubled. That essentially it's an on-off thing. You practice and you can get a little better, but essentially we all have issues until we reach sagehood. And furthermore, the Stoics quibbled a little bit amongst themselves, since they were philosophers at the end of the day. And that's perfectly healthy and fine. But some of them said that there was ever no historic sage, that nobody ever actually reached sagehood. They held certain people up to admiration, like Socrates. And some Stoics said, yes, sages existed, and some say, no, it's a theoretical ideal and nobody can ever actually reach this. But there's no gradual path in a sense. It's essentially you keep on practicing and then one day you will get to sagehood, maybe, if it's even possible. But there's no clear path like there is in Buddhism.
Yeah, and to me that sits very well with at least my own approach in a secular Buddhist view of the world and how we might live in it, is that there's no specific time that one might find this journey to take and have it end with, the bright flash and, now I'm enlightened. I'm a bit skeptical about that. I'm very strongly skeptical about that. I remain that way. And when I frequently ask those who make very strong statements about enlightenment in a traditional way, please give me the name of someone who is perfectly enlightened today, with millions of practicing Buddhists in the world. Surely, with this path being one that certainly runs to enlightenment like water down a hill, we ought to have a few arhants walking around in the classical view. And yet I don't see that. So folks, if you're listening to this and oh yes, so-and-so is perfectly enlightened, and they have extinguished all of the fetters and everything else, I'd love to hear from you. Please
contact me and tell me if you do Skype sessions, because I'd like to
I'd like
learn
to have
from
that
you.
person on the podcast.
Yeah.
So I want to shift a little bit and just mention a couple of other things and have you describe this to the crowd. You also have a couple of things coming up in New York. There's the New York City Stoics that you have, and folks listening, I will be linking to this in the link section for this episode, so be sure to check that out. And also have you say a little bit about Stoicon.
Okay. So New York City Stoics is kind of how I got into Stoicism and kind of tried to bring it to the ground, so people had a place to meet for actually discussing and perhaps practicing Stoicism. So I just founded it as a meetup on meetup.com in 2013, and it's slowly but steadily grown since then. And essentially we tackle various Stoic writings, both ancient and modern, and have different themes. And we meet once a month. And right now we're taking the year studying Seneca. So we're reading a lot, but not all of Seneca's writings each month. And then we also have peer practice groups where we extract exercises from the reading and then hand it off to people to try to practice on their own for a month if they want. But essentially, it's an informal meetup. Some people just come to learn more about Stoicism from an intellectual point of view, but also we try to encourage some practice. In the same vein, I recently became director of membership for something called the Stoic Fellowship, whose goal is to try to encourage and lower the barriers to entry for on-the-ground Stoic meetups, however they want to do it. We're trying to be quite ecumenical in that regard, but hopefully our work is to lower the barrier to getting more in person-to-person interactions about Stoicism in local communities. So that's what I'm doing on that front. And we are also bringing to the first time Stoicon, the Stoic Convention, which started in 2012 to New York City. And that's going to be October 15th, 2016. It started in 2012 as a project out of the University of Exeter in the UK. And it's run by a mix of academics and non-academics to bring practical Stoicism to anybody who's interested in it. And there's a discussion on a wide range of topics. And usually around Stoicon, there's an online 1-week course called Stoic Week, which is available for free. And you can just sign up and practice Stoicism on your own and interact with people on the internet. However, following that or around that is Stoicon. And Stoicon, what we're trying to do is trying to start rotating it around the world since it's been in the UK for the past few years. And Massimo Pigliucci and myself, since we're both based in New York City, are bringing it to New York City on October 15th. And it's going to have a range of speakers from the Stoic Week Initiative, some usual suspects, as well as some people who are new or native to New York City. We have, for instance, Debbie Joffe Ellis, who is the wife of Albert Ellis, who was the founder of rational motive behavior therapy, which was the first form of cognitive behavior therapy. And so she's going to be talking about rational motive behavior therapy, which has lots of similarities to Stoicism, much more than some other forms of cognitive behavior therapy. And she's also going to be showing how Albert Ellis in his last years of life was a Stoic in a lot of senses. We're also going to be having a psychologist, Donald Robertson, who's going to start off the talk talking about mindfulness, Stoicism, and cognitive behavior therapy. We're also going to be having lots of people speaking about a broad range of topics from how to deal with anger to how to deal with political activism and how to be a Stoic political activist and how to cope with when politics doesn't go your way necessarily, how the Stoic deal with it, which happens.
Many of us are struggling with that one.
Yep, that's exactly why he's doing it. He's a Brit who recently underwent the Brexit scenario, and he's going to be talking about politics from a neutral standpoint. He's not going to be giving political views. He's going to talk about what if your preferred presidential candidate doesn't win? How would a Stoic deal with that, and go through some practical stuff? And I'm doing a workshop in the afternoon on sati and prasoke, which is going to go over the basics of both of them. I'm going to focus on the 4 foundations of mindfulness for people who are new to Buddhist mindfulness, ancient Buddhist mindfulness, and who know more about Stoicism. And I'm also going to focus on prasoke for people who know more about sati and mindfulness, but don't know much about prasoke itself. So essentially it's going to be workshops, lectures in the morning and workshops in the afternoon that will be practical, and will end with a keynote speech by Ryan Holiday, who's author of The Obstacle's the Way, which is about turning obstacles into opportunities. And the title of his book is from Marcus Aurelius. So essentially, it should be a lot of fun and pretty educational with a wide range of topics, ranging from mindfulness to Michel Foucault's take on Stoicism to CBT and more.
Thank you for telling us about that. Anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
I think we just about covered it all.
Excellent. Well, our guest today, Gregory Lopez. I'll be linking to the meetup for New York City Stoics, as well as a couple other things that we've mentioned here on the podcast. Greg, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.